I've studied history a lot, and the Civil War in particular, our American Civil War. And one of the things that struck me was the fact that much of the South um, really didn't have anything directly to do with slavery. That the average small farmer didn't have a slave. Now, they were inclined to support slavery uh, because that's the way the elites of their particular uh, society worked it. I mean, the vast majority of people who owned slaves um, were something like our 1% now. Um, they had the money, they had the land, and they had the slaves. But the people who actually fought the war were by and large farmers from all over the South who didn't have slaves. Um, Now, the enmity between, the racial enmity was a big factor, of course. Um, but uh, the simple fact is that the people who ran the war, the um, elite landowners of the South who had slaves, they held the narrative the for the South at that time, and so they got all kinds of yeoman farmers to join in something that they themselves were not ever going to participate in, which was in the use of slaves on their farms. So how do politicians do that? I mean, the political process, how do they do that? You have something that is really not your interest, and they convince you that it is. This happens over and over in the political process. The Biden administration, for instance, was quite unpopular, at least partly because of, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also COVID. Actually, they mopped up pretty well on COVID. If you've ever read the book Aerosmith by Sinclair Lewis, he's talking about a medical, he wrote it in the 1920s, and he wrote it after the Spanish flu. And basically, it was about coming up with a therapy for plague, actually. And anyway, the whole book is about the resistance that people had to being quarantined and having their economic life stopped. And the narrative has been, oh, those awful people, those educated people who knew about the ins and outs of virology, but didn't seem to know the ins and outs of everyday people's economic. The problem is that the people who actually knew something about it were not really listened to, and they were griped about, and they have continued to kind of hold the narrative of that. And how did that happen? Now, I mean, the reality is that COVID was moderately deadly. If it were Ebola or something that was ferociously deadly, maybe there would be different reactions. I mean, Europe closed down for about a decade because of the plague. And about a quarter of the population died. And of course, they had no way of fighting that. I mean, they had community talking to each other, but they didn't really have any specific strategies except quarantine. And of course, quarantine and isolation are sort of the opposite of evolution. Evolution has brought us together. We are social animals. We are social animals as much as the birds and the bees. Well, the birds not so much, but the bees and the ants and all of those. We're much more like them than we are like cats, which tend to be solitary. Anyway, the point is, how do politicians make us want something that's really not good for us? I was having a conversation years ago now. I remember it started out talking about opera, and I enjoy opera. But I was talking to a person probably 30 years old, young woman, and I said to her, well, you know, the thing is, you're 30 and you're having all these feelings, and you're up against life, and things are pretty amazing for you in an emotional way. When you get old, you don't have that emotional kind of experience as much because many of your trials are in the past. So I said opera, which tends to be functioning on an incredibly emotional level, is much more interesting to somebody who's had a few of those experiences than it is to somebody who has not. It's also a matter of exposure, of course. If you've never heard opera, you're never going to, it's not going to make much sense to you. I mean, if all you hear is hip hop or pop music, that's what you're going to focus on. But mostly, the resonant center of opera is an emotional center. And there's nothing quite so powerful as, I remember the first time I went to an opera. I was probably 40, almost 40 anyway, late 30s. And it was Tosca. And I remember the Te Deum at the end of the first act. And I remember it's just an amazing piece. And of course, this was Met Opera, and I saw it in Minneapolis, but it was Kathleen Battle and others of note. And I burst into tears at the end of that, and I just wanted to leave because I thought it was over. Well, there were two more acts, and there were some great things in those acts, but not as great as the Te Deum was. It's an emotional thing, but if you're never exposed to it, you don't know that. And if your life is fairly emotional because you're living it as a young person, well, you don't really need that as much, although I would say you might enjoy it. You have to work at getting into it. It's like a foreign language. You need exposure. But how do politicians get us to vote for things that are not really in our interest? Right now, what's going on in our national life is a sort of, well, I would say it's an incredible assault upon it's almost a class assault. Our federal government has depended, and even our local governments depend on wisdom and expertise, whether you like it or not. I mean, populists don't like what they call a deep state because they see that the power is sort of in the court of those who are in the know about something. If you've studied a particular niche in life, you're going to know that niche pretty well. And if you're a populist outsider who looks in at the niche and says, "Well, I don't like this. We want to get rid of this deep state stuff." Well, that kind of anger is superficial, is what it is. I remember seeing a picture in a news magazine of a woman holding a piece of paper, and she was at a town meeting of her senator, and she was, and there was a kind of, obviously she was upset, and she was upset about something specific. But whether that politician had anything to do with the problem she was upset about, or had a solution to that problem, that there's no connection there. Now, most of what seems to be going on with the Trump administration is the reversal of the New Deal from the 1930s. Conservatives in those days were laissez-faire capitalists. And Herbert Hoover, when the crash happened in 1929, the stock market crash, he had no tools with which to work because he was a laissez-faire capitalist. Laissez-faire means you leave it alone. Well, you can't leave a Great Depression alone. And there were things that could be done, and Franklin Roosevelt came in 1930 and started doing some of those things. Some of the things that they did were not good. Hawley Smoot tariff, put walls up all over. Tariffs are just dreadful, dreadful things, and President Trump loves them, apparently, and unfortunately, the way the Congress has set it up for the president is he can raise tariffs whenever he wants about whatever he wants. And there's a kind of stupidity to that. Tariffs are a really stupid thing because they become reciprocal, and basically the people, when you raise a tariff on a goods coming in, and we're a net, we consume more than we produce. Everybody else pretty much produces more than they consume. So they want our market. They want to sell stuff to us because that's important to their economy, but it's important to our economy too. The way the world is economically, President Trump gets rattled about the balance of trade, seeing that we are, we're always, the outflow of our capital is greater than the inflow of it in terms of the trade, the balance of trade. But balance of trade sort of makes sense because we're the largest or next to the largest economy, and so we're consuming a lot of stuff, and that's good for all kinds of other people, not just for us. We get to consume it, but we're also, economics is pretty reciprocal. It's both sides, and when you get something stupid that cuts off the reciprocity like tariffs do, well, he'll figure it out. Once people begin to realize that, he doesn't know what he's doing when it comes to that economic stuff. I mean, people think, oh, he's great, he's a billionaire, so he ought to know what he's doing. No, he knows what he can do for himself and his class. He's not doing anything for the rest of us. he just doesn't understand what is needed. Now, he sounds like he understands because he responds very, 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 very specifically to the concerns of other people. But here, the economy was doing pretty well. Inflation was not going to go down because inflation, by and large, happened because our government printed money in order to give money out during COVID. So that check that you got that kept your life going during COVID, if you got a check, that was from money that wasn't in the system. They just printed the money. And that creates inflation. So that inflation isn't going to go away. You can sort of wear it down, which is what the Federal Reserve does with its interest rate process. But, you know, you don't really want to have a time of deflation. Those happen too. They can happen in economics, but we really don't want that. Anyway, but how do the politicians get focused? And so people were, they're upset about inflation, that the economy is terrible, when actually, in most ways, the economy was pretty good, about as good as it ever gets. And, that inflation was around 2%, which is where the Fed likes to keep it if they can. We're not printing a lot of money to pay our bills, which increases inflation. Those countries with runaway inflation, like Germany in the 1920s, or Argentina on occasion, it's nothing more than increasing the money supply by printing more money. Well, at least that's the simple explanation. I'm sure it's more complicated than that. And my economics is from reading since I was in college. I didn't take any economics in college, which I'm sorry for, which is why I've read a lot of economic stuff. But still, here we are. People got upset about immigration, not thinking about it in sort of a little more complicated session. A number of our businesses depend upon immigration. There are those visas that are for highly qualified people who come, and when I go to my Costco here in Kansas City, well, there are two of them, and I go to both of them actually, but when I go to the one out here in Overland Park, about a third of the people there are Asian and immigrants from other places, and they're engineers, because we have a lot of engineering companies in Kansas City, and they make good livings. But one of the tricks of that trade is that the companies that get them on a visa, and of course they don't get as much money as they could get if they had a more independent existence. Once they become citizens, they can act more independently. But people got all upset about it. I agree that something had to be done, and there was actually a bipartisan agreement on immigration, and the candidate Trump nixed it because he wanted to run on immigration. But by the time he was running on immigration, the Biden administration had already tightened down at the border. And so the amount of people coming over was much reduced. You know, that's what usually happens. I mean, Ronald Reagan did a huge buildup of the military budget and outspent the Soviets by quite a bit, and that led to at least the presenting problems that ended the Cold War. But the fact is that Carter had started building up the budget at the end, near the end of his term. They already saw it as a priority. Well, you know, Trump's way of doing it is he gets us involved in some little problem like, he's closing USAID, and that's foreign investment, and most Americans don't care about that. We only care about domestic stuff, and so we're not terribly worried about that. But for those things that we are worried about, like Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, and those kinds of things that are going to have a big group of people who don't want him to rock the boat on that, he's going to rock the boat. He's going to do some damaging stuff, but he's going to do it by getting us to hear about how awful the judges are and how they should be impeached, which is an irrelevant thing since he can't do anything about impeachment. That's strictly a congressional thing. And the Congress seems to be avoiding all responsibility at this point, which it has been for the last 30 years, really. Only passing things that it absolutely has to pass, like funding the government for another, till September this time. But nothing really gets done. And when you have an initiative like the Affordable Care Act, that has resistance. I don't exactly understand what the resistance to universal care is. I mean, I do understand the arguments about it. I just don't. Seems to me a healthy population would be a better place to live than one that isn't healthy. Well, politicians do things over here and they keep them as quiet as they can while doing stuff over here that excites us and makes us think that they're good. Because that's pretty much what the politicians in the Civil War did. They were ramping up the racial hatred and to get the yeoman farmers who were the troops after all for the Civil War for the South, and that, of course, ramping up that racial hatred, pretty much similar to what was done in Yugoslavia as it disintegrated after Tito, and the politicians ratcheted up the atavistic hatreds they had for each group. These groups spoke the same language. They had different religions, but they all spoke the same languages. They were pretty well integrated, and in Yugoslavia itself. And then the politicians came along and said, "Oh, by the way, 400 years ago, these people, you know, these Croats did terrible things to your people. If you were one of the other groups, there are three main groups there, and they all speak the same language. They all have different religions, but they didn't hate each other as much during Yugoslavia when it existed. And then when it didn't exist, the warlords thought they would gin up the thing. So that's how politicians do it. They're doing stuff over here that's bad for you, or that's maybe against your interests. But over here, they're telling you stuff that they think you want to hear. Well, anyway, good luck with all that.